Hi, I'm Paulina Luna. 3 months ago, I woke up in a hospital bed with no memory of the past 12 hours, and my newborn daughter was gone. My parents stood at my bedside with tears in their eyes, telling me she had died during delivery. What they didn't know was that St. Mary's Medical Center had installed a new high-definition security system just 2 weeks before my due date. What they didn't know was that every lie, every injection, every whispered conversation in the hallway was captured in crystal clear detail. What they didn't know was that their own greed would become the evidence that brought them down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Phoenix heat was suffocating that Tuesday morning in March, when I first felt the contractions. I was 38 weeks pregnant, and my body felt like it was carrying the weight of the world. Michael, my husband, was at a construction site 2 hours away, finishing up a project that would help us afford the nursery we'd been planning for months. I called him first, then my parents, Robert and Linda Luna, who had insisted from the beginning that they wanted to be there for everything. They arrived at our small apartment in Scottsdale within 20 minutes, which should have been my first warning. My father never drove that fast for anything, not even emergencies. My mother carried a small overnight bag that seemed too prepared, too organized for someone who had supposedly rushed over. But I was in labor, scared and grateful for any help I could get. The drive to St. Mary's Medical Center felt endless. Each contraction hit me like a wave, and my mother kept reaching back from the passenger seat to stroke my hair, whispering that everything would be perfect, that they would take care of everything. My father's eyes met mine in the rearview mirror, more than once, and something in his expression made my stomach turn, though I couldn't place why. At the hospital, things moved quickly. Too quickly. The admissions nurse, Jessica Williams, was efficient and kind, walking us through paperwork, while I breathed through another contraction. My parents flanked me on either side, answering questions I should have been answering myself. When the nurse asked about my birth plan, my mother spoke before I could. "She wants all the pain medication available," Linda said firmly. "She's always been sensitive to pain, haven't you, sweetheart?" I opened my mouth to correct her. I had specifically wanted to try natural birth first, maybe an epidural if absolutely necessary. But my mother's hand squeezed my shoulder with unexpected force. The contraction hit again, stealing my breath and my ability to argue. Dr. Sarah Martinez, my obstetrician, met us in the labor and delivery ward. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and steady hands, someone I had trusted throughout my entire pregnancy. But when she reviewed my chart, her brow furrowed slightly. "The notes here indicate you've requested immediate pain management," she said, looking at me directly. "Is that correct?" Before I could answer, my father stepped forward. "Doctor, our daughter has been anxious about the pain for months. We just want her to be comfortable." Dr. Martinez nodded slowly, but I caught her glancing at me again, as if she was waiting for me to confirm or deny. Another contraction hit, stronger, this time, and I gripped the bed rail so hard my knuckles went white. "Yes," I gasped, though something deep in my gut whispered that I was making a mistake. Whatever will help. The next few hours blurred together in a haze of medical activity and increasing discomfort. Michael called twice, but the reception was spotty. Each time my mother took the phone, assuring him that everything was progressing normally, that he should focus on finishing his work, that we would call him the moment the baby arrived. "Let him finish the project," she told me after the second call. "You know how much you need that money. Besides, babies take forever with first pregnancies. He'll make it in time." The labor progressed faster than anyone expected. By early afternoon, I was fully dilated and ready to push. But instead of the natural process I had read about, the medical team began preparing an IV drip that Dr. Martinez explained would help with pain management during delivery. "This will make everything much easier," she said, though her voice carried a note I couldn't identify. "You'll be comfortable, and we can monitor everything more closely. My mother held my hand as the nurse inserted the IV. This is exactly what you need, Paulina. Trust us. We know what's best. The medication hit my system like a freight train. The world became soft around the edges, sounds muffled, time stretching and compressing in ways that made no sense. I was aware of the pushing, of Dr. Martinez's calm voice giving instructions, of my parents' faces hovering at the edge of my vision. But everything felt distant, like I was watching someone else's life through thick glass. "She's crowning," Dr. Martinez announced, and I tried to focus, tried to be present for the moment I had been anticipating for 9 months. But the drugs pulled me under like a tide, and consciousness slipped away from me entirely. When I woke up, the room was dim. Evening light filtered through the hospital window, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. My parents sat in chairs beside my bed, their faces etched with what looked like grief. My mother's eyes were red and swollen, and my father's. Normally steady hands trembled as he reached for mine. "Paulina, sweetheart," my mother whispered, her voice breaking. "We need to tell you something." The words hit me before I was fully awake, before I could prepare myself for what was coming. The baby, my daughter, Emma. I had chosen the name months ago, whispering it to my belly during those late-night moments when she would kick and roll inside me. "Where is she?" I asked, though part of me already knew from their expressions that something was terribly wrong. My father cleared his throat, the sound rough and painful. "There were complications, Paulina. During the delivery. Dr. Martinez did everything she could, but..." "But what?" My voice came out as a croak. My throat felt raw, like I had been screaming, though I couldn't remember making any sound at all. "The cord was wrapped around her neck," my mother said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "She couldn't breathe." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. The words didn't make sense. I stared at them, waiting for the punchline, for someone to tell me this was some kind of sick joke. I had felt her moving that morning. Strong kicks, the hiccups that had become so familiar. Babies didn't just die like that. Not my baby. Not Emma. "I want to see her," I said, trying to sit up. The room spun violently, and I realized I was still heavily medicated. "I want to hold my daughter." My parents exchanged a look that I caught even through the fog of whatever drugs were still in my system. It was a look of panic, quickly covered by what they probably thought was compassion. "Sweetheart, that's not a good idea," my father said gently. "You've been through trauma. The doctors think it would be better if you remember her as she was, when she was alive." "Where is Michael?" I asked, suddenly realizing that my husband should have been there, should have been the first person I saw when I woke up. "We called him," my mother said quickly. "He's driving back now. The poor man is devastated. He didn't want to believe it when we told him." Something cold settled in my chest. Not grief, not yet, but something else. Something that felt like suspicion, though I couldn't understand why. These were my parents. They had driven me to the hospital, held my hand through labor, stayed by my side while I was unconscious. They were grieving too, weren't they? But as the hours passed and Michael still hadn't arrived, as nurses came and went without mentioning my daughter, as my parents deflected every question I asked about seeing Emma's body or making arrangements, the cold feeling grew stronger. Dr. Martinez appeared in my doorway around 9 that evening. She looked tired, older than she had that morning, and when she met my eyes, something flickered across her face that I couldn't interpret. "How are you feeling, Paulina?" she asked, checking my chart at the foot of the bed. "I want to see my baby," I said before she could ask anything else. "I need to hold her." Dr. Martinez glanced at my parents, then back at me. I understand that urge, but given the circumstances— What circumstances? I interrupted, finding strength in my voice that surprised me. She was my daughter. I carried her for 9 months. I deserved to say goodbye. The doctor's expression grew more uncomfortable. Your parents have been very clear about what they think is best for your emotional recovery. Perhaps when you're feeling stronger— I'm feeling strong enough now, I said, trying again to sit up. This time, the dizziness was less severe, though my body felt like it belonged to someone else. I'm her mother. This is my decision. My mother stood up abruptly. Paulina, you're being unreasonable. You've been through a tremendous shock. The doctors gave you medication to help you rest, to help your body heal. You're not thinking clearly. What medication? I asked, though even as the words left my mouth, I realized I didn't remember consenting to anything beyond the IV for labor pain. Pain medication, my father said smoothly. Anti-anxiety medication. Things to help you through this difficult time. The cold feeling spread through my chest like ice water. I looked around the room, really looked, for the first time since waking up. There were no flowers, no balloons, none of the typical decorations that filled maternity ward rooms. There was no bassinet, no baby blankets, no evidence that a child had ever been expected in this space. Where are my things? I asked. My hospital bag, the clothes I brought for Emma? Another look passed between my parents, quicker this time but no less telling. We took care of everything, my mother said. There was no need for those things anymore. That night, after my parents finally left with promises to return first thing in the morning, I lay in the dark trying to piece together the fragments of memory I could grasp. The labor had progressed so quickly. The medication had been so strong. The way Dr. Martinez had looked at me, like she was seeing something she didn't understand. And Michael still hadn't come. I reached for my phone on the bedside table, surprised to find it there. My parents could have easily taken it, could have told me it was lost or damaged. But there it was, fully charged, as if someone had been caring for it while I was unconscious. I called Michael's number, my hands shaking as I held the phone to my ear. It rang once, twice, 3 times before his voice came through, thick with exhaustion and something that sounded like confusion. Paulina? Jesus, baby, where are you? I've been trying to get to the hospital for hours, but your parents keep telling me different things. First they said you were still in labor, then they said there were complications, then they said you were sedated and couldn't have visitors. My blood turned to ice. Michael, what did they tell you about the baby? What about the baby? They said Emma was born this afternoon, that she's healthy, that you're both resting. I've been trying to get information about visiting hours, but every time I call the hospital, they transfer me around and nobody seems to know anything. The phone slipped from my numb fingers and clattered onto the bed. Michael's voice continued to come through the speaker, growing more frantic as he repeated my name, but I couldn't process the words anymore. My parents had told me Emma was dead. They had told Michael she was alive and healthy. 2 completely different stories, and I was the only one who knew about both versions. I picked up the phone with trembling hands. Michael, I need you to come to the hospital right now. Don't call ahead. Don't tell anyone you're coming. Just get here as fast as you can. Paulina, what's wrong? You're scaring me. Please, I whispered, checking the doorway to make sure no nurses were nearby. Something is very wrong here, and I need you. After we hung up, I forced myself to get out of bed despite the lingering effects of whatever medication was still in my system. My legs felt like rubber, and the room tilted sickeningly, but I managed to make it to the small bathroom attached to my room. In the mirror, I looked like someone recovering from major surgery, not someone who had given birth hours earlier. My reflection was pale, my pupils dilated despite the bright bathroom light. Dark circles ringed my eyes, and when I touched my face, My skin felt cold and clammy. This wasn't what natural childbirth recovery was supposed to look like. This was what being heavily drugged looked like. I splashed cold water on my face and tried to think clearly. If Emma was alive, as my parents had told Michael, where was she? If she was dead, as they had told me, why lie to Michael? And why did neither story match what Dr. Martinez had said, or what the nurses had implied? Back in bed, I stared at the ceiling and tried to reconstruct the day. I remembered the contractions starting, the drive to the hospital, the admission, process. I remembered my mother insisting on pain medication, my father speaking for me when I should have been speaking for myself. I remembered Dr. Martinez's concerned expression when she reviewed my chart, as if something didn't match what she expected. And I remembered the IV, the medication that had pulled me under so completely that I had no memory of Emma's actual birth. No memory of hearing her cry or seeing her face or feeling her skin against mine. What mother forgets the moment their child is born? What mother wakes up hours later with no memory of the most important experience of their life? The answer was simple and terrifying. A mother who had been drugged into unconsciousness so she couldn't witness what was really happening. Michael arrived just after midnight, slipping into my room like he was afraid of being caught. His face was drawn with worry and exhaustion, his work clothes still dusty from the construction site. When he saw me, relief and confusion warred in his expression. "Paulina, thank God. I've been so worried. Your parents wouldn't let me talk to you, and the hospital staff kept giving me different information. Where's Emma? Why isn't she in here with you?" I reached for his hands, gripping them tightly as I tried to find the words to explain what I was beginning to suspect. "Michael, sit down. I need to tell you what my parents told me, and then I need you to tell me exactly what they told you." As I recounted my version of events, Michael's face grew paler and paler. When I finished, he sat in stunned silence for several long moments before speaking. "They told me Emma was born at 2:30 this afternoon," he said slowly. 7 pounds, 3 ounces, perfectly healthy. They said you had a difficult labor, but that both of you were fine, just resting. They said the hospital had a policy about limiting visitors for the first 24 hours, especially with the new baby. "But they told me she died during delivery," I whispered. "They said the cord was around her neck, that Dr. Martinez couldn't save her." Michael's hands tightened around mine. "One of those stories is a lie, Paulina. The question is, which one and why?" We sat together in the dim hospital room, holding hands and trying to make sense of the impossible situation. 2 stories, both told by the same people, both delivered, with tears and apparent sincerity. But only one could be true. "I want to see her," I said finally. "Alive or dead, I want to see my daughter. I want to hold her and know for myself what happened." Michael nodded grimly. "And I want to talk to Dr. Martinez without your parents in the room. I want to hear from her exactly what happened during the delivery." "There's something else," I added, though it felt almost too paranoid to voice. "The medication they gave me was much stronger than anything I agreed to. I don't remember anything about Emma's birth, nothing about the actual delivery." "That's not normal, Michael. Even with an epidural, mothers are awake and aware when their babies are born." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I think they drugged me unconscious so I couldn't see what was really happening. And if that's true, if they were willing to do that, then we need to find out what they were trying to hide." The rest of that night passed in a blur of whispered conversations and growing dread. Michael stayed beside my bed, both of us afraid to sleep, afraid of what might happen if we weren't vigilant. We didn't talk about the worst-case scenarios we were both imagining, but the possibilities hung in the air between us like smoke. When dawn finally broke over Phoenix, painting the hospital room in shades of gold and amber, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find my daughter, whatever the truth might be, and I was going to make sure that whoever had hurt us would face the consequences of their actions. What I didn't know yet was that every moment of our nightmare had been captured by cameras I didn't even know existed. What I didn't know was that the evidence of my parents' betrayal was already waiting in a digital storage system, time-stamped and undeniable. What I didn't know was that the truth would be so much worse than anything I had imagined. The morning brought new lies wrapped in familiar voices. My parents arrived at 7 sharp, carrying coffee and pastries like this was some kind of social visit rather than the aftermath of losing my child. My mother's makeup was perfect, her hair styled as if she had taken time to prepare for an important event. My father wore his best suit, the navy one he reserved for church and business meetings. Neither looked like people who had spent the night grieving the loss of their first grandchild. "How are you feeling this morning, sweetheart?" My mother asked, setting down a cup of coffee on the bedside table. The smell made my stomach turn, though I couldn't tell if it was from the lingering effects of whatever medication they had given me, or from the growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. "I want to see Emma," I said without preamble. There was no point in pleasantries anymore, no point in pretending that their presence comforted me when every instinct I had was screaming that they were hiding something crucial. My father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Paulina, we discussed this last night. Dr. Martinez thinks it would be traumatic for you to see her in her current state. You need to focus on healing, both physically and emotionally." "Dr. Martinez can speak for herself," I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "I want to talk to her directly, without either of you in the room." The look that passed between my parents lasted only a fraction of a second, but I caught it. It was the same look they had exchanged countless times throughout my childhood when I had asked questions they didn't want to answer, when I had pushed against boundaries they had set without explanation. It was a look of conspiracy, of shared knowledge that excluded me entirely. "Of course," my mother said smoothly. "We'll arrange that. But first, there are some practical matters we need to discuss. Arrangements need to be made, paperwork needs to be filed. Your father has already spoken with the funeral home." The funeral home. The words hit me like a physical blow. In less than 24 hours, my parents had already moved forward with plans to bury my daughter. Plans that apparently didn't require my input or consent. They had made decisions about Emma's body, about her final resting place, about ceremonies I hadn't even been told about, all while I was unconscious and unable to participate. "What funeral home?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. "Henderson Family Services," my father replied. "They're very discreet, very professional. They understand the sensitive nature of infant loss." Henderson Family Services. I knew that name, though it took me a moment to place where I had heard it before. Then I remembered. It was the funeral home my parents had used when my grandmother died 3 years earlier. The same funeral home where my father served on the board of directors, where he had connections and influence. "You chose a funeral home without asking me?" The words came out louder than I intended, and a nurse passing in the hallway glanced toward our room with concern. "We were trying to spare you the burden," my mother said, her voice taking on the patient tone she had always used when she thought I was being unreasonable. "You were sedated, in no condition to make these kinds of decisions. Someone had to take charge." "I'm her mother," I said, the simple truth feeling revolutionary as it left my lips. "These decisions are mine to make." "And you'll make them," my father assured me. But the initial arrangements had to be handled quickly. There are health department regulations, time constraints. We couldn't wait. Health department regulations, time constraints. The words felt rehearsed, like lines from a script they had practiced. But even through the fog of grief and medication, I knew enough about death and burial to understand that newborns didn't typically require immediate disposition of remains. Families were usually given time to process, time to say goodbye, time to make informed decisions about memorialization. Unless there was a reason someone wanted the body to disappear quickly. "I want to see the paperwork," I said. "All of it. The death certificate, the hospital forms, everything you signed on my behalf." Another look between them, this one less subtle than before. "Of course," my mother said. "It's all at home. We can bring it this afternoon when you're feeling stronger." "I'm feeling strong enough now," I replied. "And I want to see Dr. Martinez before you bring any paperwork. I want to hear directly from her what happened during the delivery." "Paulina." My father's voice carried a warning tone I recognized from childhood, the tone that meant I was approaching a line I wasn't supposed to cross. "You're being unreasonable. We're trying to help you through this, but you're making it more difficult than it needs to be." "Difficult for whom?" I asked, meeting his gaze directly. "Difficult for you? Because it seems to me that losing my child should be difficult. It seems to me that wanting answers should be natural. It seems to me that being excluded from decisions about my own daughter's body should be unacceptable." My mother reached over and took my hand, her grip firmer than necessary. "Sweetheart, grief affects people in different ways. Sometimes it makes us paranoid, makes us see conspiracies where none exist. You're looking for someone to blame, somewhere to direct your anger. But sometimes tragedies just happen." Paranoid. The word hung in the air like poison gas. It was the same word my parents had used throughout my childhood whenever I questioned their decisions, whenever I pushed back against their control. When I was 8 and asked why I couldn't go to my friend Sarah's birthday party, my mother had told me I was being paranoid about their reasons. When I was 16 and questioned why they had read my diary and confiscated my phone, my father had said I was being paranoid about privacy. When I was 22 and wondered why they had accessed my bank account without permission to help with a bill, they had both assured me that my paranoia was unfounded. Paranoia had become their weapon of choice whenever I threatened to uncover truths they preferred to keep hidden. "Maybe I am paranoid," I said slowly. "Maybe losing my child has made me suspicious of everyone and everything. But that doesn't mean my questions aren't valid. That doesn't mean I don't deserve answers." "Of course you deserve answers," my mother soothed, "and you'll get them. But right now, you need to focus on taking care of yourself. You need to let us take care of the difficult details so you can heal. Take care of the difficult details. Let them handle everything while I remained passive and grateful." It was the same dynamic that had defined our relationship for as long as I could remember. The same pattern of them making decisions while positioning themselves as my protectors rather than my controllers. When I was in high school, they had chosen my classes without consulting me, telling me later that they knew what was best for my future. When I was in college, they had influenced my major by threatening to withdraw financial support if I pursued art instead of business. When Michael and I started dating, they had run a background check on him without telling me, presenting their findings as evidence of their caring rather than their intrusion. Every major decision in my life had been filtered through their judgment, their approval, their vision of what my life should look like. And now, in the most devastating moment I had ever experienced, they were doing it again, taking charge, making choices, positioning themselves as the responsible adults while treating me like a child who couldn't be trusted with important decisions. "Where's Michael?" I asked suddenly, realizing that my husband should have returned by now. "He said he was coming back this morning." "We sent him home to get some rest," my father said. "The poor man was exhausted, and there's nothing he can do here right now." "You sent him home?" The words came out as barely more than a whisper. "You told my husband to leave without asking me." "He needed sleep," my mother said reasonably. "And you need space to process this loss without having to worry about taking care of anyone else." But Michael wasn't anyone else. He was Emma's father, my partner, the person who should have been making these decisions with me. He was the one person in this situation who had every right to be involved in choices about our daughter's body and burial. Yet my parents had dismissed him as if his grief, his needs, his parental rights were irrelevant. "Call him," I said. "I want him here now. Paulina, call him now, or I'll call him myself." My father pulled out his phone with obvious reluctance. As he dialed, I watched his face carefully, looking for any sign that he wasn't actually calling Michael's number. The conversation was brief and one-sided, my father's voice carrying the tone of someone delivering bad news rather than a simple request. "He's on his way," my father said after hanging up. "But Paulina, I think you need to consider whether putting him through this is fair. He's hurting too." "He's hurting too," I repeated. "Yes, he is. He's Emma's father. He has every right to hurt, and every right to be involved in what happens next." "Of course he does," my mother agreed quickly. "We're not trying to exclude him. We're trying to protect both of you from having to deal with details that can be handled by people with more experience in these situations." People with more experience, like themselves, like the funeral home director who served on boards with my father, like the doctors and nurses who seemed to defer to their wishes, rather than consulting me directly. Like everyone except the two people who had actually created Emma, who had loved her before she was born, who deserved to be centered in decisions about her life and death. A knock on the door interrupted the growing tension in the room. Dr. Martinez entered, carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression that seemed carefully neutral. Behind her came a woman I didn't recognize, someone in a business suit rather than medical scrubs. "Good morning, Paulina," Dr. Martinez said. "How are you feeling today?" "I want to know what happened during the delivery," I said, before she could ask any routine questions. "I want to know exactly what complications arose and what decisions were made." Dr. Martinez glanced at my parents, then at the woman in the suit, before focusing on me. "I understand your need for information. Loss like this is always difficult to process." "I don't remember anything about the delivery," I continued. "I was given medication that made me unconscious, and when I woke up, my daughter was gone. That seems unusual for a routine birth." "The medication was administered for your comfort," Dr. Martinez said carefully. "You were experiencing significant distress, and the decision was made to help you through the most difficult part of the process." "Whose decision?" I asked, because I don't remember making that decision. "Your parents were very clear about your wishes," the doctor replied. "They explained that you had requested comprehensive pain management and that you wanted to avoid any trauma associated with a difficult delivery." My parents had spoken for me again. They had made medical decisions about my body, my consciousness, my experience of giving birth to my own child. They had convinced my doctor that their interpretation of my wishes was more valid than anything I might have said myself. "Dr. Martinez," I said slowly, "I need to ask you directly. Did you personally witness my daughter's death?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She hesitated for a moment, glancing again at my parents and the woman in the suit. "The situation was complex," she said finally. "There were multiple factors involved." "That's not an answer," I pressed. "Did you see my daughter die? Did you personally confirm that she was deceased?" "Paulina," my mother interrupted, "these questions are too difficult for you right now. Dr. Martinez has already explained." "Dr. Martinez can speak for herself," I said sharply, "and I want her to answer my question." The woman in the suit stepped forward. "I'm Janet Chen from the hospital's Patient Advocacy Office," she said. "I'm here to help facilitate communication and ensure that everyone's concerns are addressed appropriately." Patient advocacy. Another barrier between me and the truth. Another professional whose job was apparently to manage my questions rather than answer them. The hospital had sent a handler, someone trained to navigate difficult situations and protect the institution from liability. I don't need advocacy, I said. I need answers. I need to know what happened to my daughter, and I need to see her body. That may not be possible, Janet Chen said gently. Given the circumstances and the time that has passed, viewing may not be advisable. What circumstances? I demanded. What specific circumstances make it inadvisable for a mother to see her deceased child? The decomposition process, my father said quietly. It's been over 12 hours, Paulina. It wouldn't be the way you'd want to remember her. Decomposition. The word was like a slap, clinical and cold, and designed to end the conversation. But even grief-stricken and medicated, I knew enough to understand that 12 hours was not long enough for significant decomposition to occur, especially in a controlled hospital environment. Where is her body now? I asked Dr. Martinez directly. She's been transferred to the funeral home, the doctor replied. Your parents made those arrangements last night. Without my consent. You were sedated and unable to make decisions, Janet Chen interjected. Next of kin are authorized to make necessary arrangements in these circumstances. I'm next of kin, I said. I'm her mother. You're also a patient recovering from a traumatic delivery, my mother said softly. The hospital staff needed to make practical decisions while you were recovering. Practical decisions. Everything was being framed as practical, necessary, routine. But nothing about this felt routine. Nothing about this followed any of the protocols or procedures I had read about during my pregnancy when I researched what would happen if something went wrong. Mothers who lost babies were supposed to be offered time with their children. They were supposed to be given choices about memorialization, about burial, about how to process their grief. They were supposed to be treated as the primary decision makers about their own children's bodies. Instead, I was being treated like an invalid whose judgment couldn't be trusted, whose wishes were less important than the practical concerns of the adults around me. Michael arrived as the meeting was winding down, his face drawn and his clothes rumpled from a sleepless night. When he saw the crowd of people in my room, his expression darkened. "What's going on?" he asked, looking from me to my parents to the hospital staff. "We were just explaining the arrangements that have been made," my father said smoothly. Paulina had some questions about the process. "What arrangements?" Michael's voice was sharp with suspicion. "What process?" I reached for his hand as he approached the bed. "They've already moved Emma's body to a funeral home," I said quietly. "They made burial arrangements without consulting us." Michael's face went pale, then flushed with anger. "They what?" "Someone had to take charge," my mother said defensively. "You were both in no condition to make these decisions, and there are time-sensitive issues that couldn't wait." "Time-sensitive issues like what?" Michael demanded. "What could possibly be so urgent that you couldn't wait for us to be involved in planning our own daughter's funeral?" "Health Department regulations," my father repeated. "Legal requirements for disposition of remains." "That's bullshit," Michael said bluntly, his construction worker's vocabulary cutting through the polite euphemisms that had been floating around the room. "I know people who've lost babies. Families get time to say goodbye. They get choices about what happens next." "Every situation is different," Janet Chen said diplomatically. "The hospital works with families to accommodate their needs within the constraints of applicable laws and regulations." "Then accommodate our need to see our daughter," Michael said. "Accommodate our need to make our own decisions about her." "Burial. That may still be possible," Dr. Martinez said carefully. "Though, as I mentioned, viewing may not be advisable given the time that has passed." "Let us decide what's advisable," I said. "Let us decide what we can handle and what we can't. Stop making choices for us like we're children who can't be trusted with difficult realities." The room fell silent for a moment. Then my mother sighed, the sound heavy with what seemed like resignation. "Of course," she said. "You're right. We've been trying so hard to protect you that we may have overstepped. We just want what's best for you both. What's best for you both? The phrase that had defined my entire relationship with my parents, the justification they used for every boundary they crossed, every decision they made without consulting me. They always knew what was best, always had the wisdom and experience to guide my choices, always positioned their control as care rather than manipulation. What would be best for us, I said carefully, is honesty. Complete honesty about what happened during the delivery, about what decisions were made and why, about where Emma is now and what our options are for saying goodbye to her. You'll have that, my father promised. We'll bring all the paperwork this afternoon, and we'll arrange for you to see Emma if that's what you really want. If that's what you really want. Even his promise came with a qualifier, a suggestion that wanting to see my deceased daughter might not be reasonable or healthy. But I was past caring about their opinions on what was reasonable. I was past trusting their judgment about what I could handle. After the hospital staff left and my parents departed with promises to return with documentation, Michael and I were finally alone together. He sat on the edge of my bed and took my hands in his calloused fingers warm against my cold skin. "This is insane," he said quietly. "None of this makes sense. Why would they drug you unconscious during delivery? Why would they move Emma's body so quickly? Why are they making decisions without us?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I know something is wrong. Everything about this feels wrong." "What did they tell you about how she died?" Michael asked. I repeated the story about the umbilical cord, about complications during delivery, about Dr. Martinez being unable to save her. As I spoke, Michael's frown deepened. "That doesn't match what they told me," he said. "They said she was born healthy. They said you were both fine." "I know, 2 different stories, and we're the only ones who know about both versions." Michael was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. Then he looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, something between determination and fear. "Paulina, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." "What? Is there any reason your parents would want to hurt Emma? Any reason they would want her to disappear?" The question hung in the air between us like a live wire. It was the thought I had been trying not to think, the possibility I had been pushing away because it was too terrible to consider. But now, that Michael had voiced it, I couldn't pretend it wasn't there. "I don't know," I whispered. "Maybe." "Maybe?" I took a shaky breath, trying to organize thoughts that felt fragmented and uncertain. "You know they never approved of us getting married. They thought you weren't good enough for me because you didn't go to college, because you work with your hands instead of sitting behind a desk. That's different from wanting to hurt our child. Is it?" I met his eyes directly. "They've spent my entire life trying to control who I am, who I'm with, what choices I make. Having a baby with you, starting a family with you, it makes me less dependent on them. It makes their opinion less important in my life." Michael's jaw tightened. "You think they would hurt Emma to maintain control over you?" "I think they would do a lot of things to maintain control over me," I said slowly. "I think they've been doing things my whole life that I convinced myself were normal because they're my parents, and I wanted to believe they loved me." "What kinds of things?" The flood of memories came without warning. 30 years of small betrayals and boundary violations that I had explained away as overprotectiveness or love. The diary they read when I was 14, claiming they were worried about my mental health. The college applications they filled out on my behalf, choosing schools and majors that aligned with their vision for my future. The job interview they sabotaged when I was 25 because they thought the position would take me too far from home. The boyfriend in college they had driven away by convincing him I was emotionally unstable. the apartment lease they had co-signed and then used to gain access to my living space whenever they wanted, the credit cards they had opened in my name to build my credit, cards they continued to monitor and manage long after I was old enough to handle my own finances, the bank account they had insisted on maintaining access to, ostensibly to help with emergencies, but which they used to track my spending and question my choices, the spare key to my apartment they had kept and used, claiming they needed to check on me but really needing to maintain surveillance over my life. Each incident, taken alone, could be explained as parental concern. Taken together, they formed a pattern of control so pervasive that I had never been able to make a major life decision without their input, their approval, their management. They've never let me be independent, I told Michael. Every time I've tried to build a life that doesn't center them, they've found ways to undermine it or sabotage it or convince me that I'm making a mistake. But Emma is their grandchild, Michael protested. Why would they hurt their own grandchild? Because she's not their grandchild, I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. She's our daughter. She's evidence that you and I built something together that doesn't include them. She's proof that I chose you over their objections, that I'm creating a family that puts them in a secondary role. Michael stared at me, his face pale with understanding. You think they took her? I think they did something, I said carefully. I don't know what, but I think they did something to ensure that Emma couldn't threaten their control over my life. Then we need to find out what happened, Michael said grimly. We need to find Emma, and we need to make sure they can never hurt us again. As he spoke, I felt something shift inside me, some fundamental change in how I understood my relationship with my parents and my own agency in the world. For 30 years, I had accepted their version of reality, their interpretation of events, their judgment about what was best for me. But Emma changed everything, whether she was alive or dead, whether she had been stolen or killed or hidden away. My parents had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They had made decisions about my child without my consent, and they had done it with the same casual assumption of authority they had always used to manage my life. The difference was that now I finally understood what that authority had cost me, and I was ready to fight back. What I didn't know yet was that every moment of their betrayal had been captured by security cameras I didn't even know existed. What I didn't know was that the evidence of their crimes was already waiting in digital storage, time-stamped and irrefutable. What I didn't know was that the truth would prove to be both worse and better than anything I could have imagined. The discharge papers felt like lies in my hands. 24 hours after supposedly losing my daughter, the hospital was releasing me with instructions for postpartum care and a follow-up appointment I had no intention of keeping. Dr. Martinez had avoided eye contact during our final conversation, and the nursing staff seemed eager to process my departure as quickly as possible. Everything about my exit felt rushed, orchestrated, designed to get me out of the building before I could ask more uncomfortable questions. Michael helped me into the passenger seat of his truck, his movements careful and protective. The Arizona sun was brutal even at 10 in the morning, and the heat radiating off the asphalt made my head swim. Or maybe that was still the lingering effects of whatever drugs they had given me during delivery. Either way, I felt disconnected from my own body, like I was watching someone else's life unfold through a window. Where do you want to go? Michael asked as he started the engine. Home? Your parents' house? Neither, I said without hesitation. I want to go to Henderson Family Services. Michael's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Paulina, are you sure that's a good idea? Maybe we should wait until you're feeling stronger. I'm not going to feel stronger until I see Emma, I replied. I need to know she's really there. I need to see her body with my own eyes. The drive across Phoenix took 45 minutes through traffic that seemed determined to delay us. Every red light felt like a personal insult, every slow-moving vehicle like a conspiracy to keep me from my daughter. Michael tried to make conversation, asking how I was feeling and whether I needed to stop for water or food, but I couldn't focus on anything except the growing certainty that Henderson Family Services wouldn't have Emma's body because Emma wasn't dead. The funeral home occupied a sprawling single-story building in an upscale part of Scottsdale, all adobe walls and tasteful landscaping designed to project serenity and comfort. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of flowers and something chemical I couldn't identify. A receptionist with perfectly styled gray hair greeted us with the kind of professional sympathy that felt rehearsed. "We're here about Emma Luna Chen," I said before she could offer condolences or ask how she could help us. "She was brought here yesterday from St. Mary's Medical Center." The receptionist's fingers moved across her computer keyboard with practiced efficiency. After a moment, she looked up with an expression that seemed genuinely confused. "I'm sorry, but I don't show any record of that name in our system. Are you certain she was brought to this location?" My heart started racing. Check again. Emma Luna Chen, born yesterday at St. Mary's, transferred here by Robert and Linda Luna. More typing, more searching, more confusion. I'm showing several arrangements made by Robert Luna in recent weeks, but none involving an infant. Are you possibly thinking of a different funeral home? No, I said, my voice getting louder despite my efforts to stay calm. My parents specifically said Henderson Family Services. They said they had already made arrangements, that Emma's body was already here. "Let me check with our director," the receptionist said, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Please have a seat, and I'll see what I can find out." Michael. And I sat in the reception area on furniture that was probably meant to be comforting but felt like waiting room chairs in a doctor's office. The walls were covered with photos of flower arrangements and testimonials from grateful families, but all I could think about was the fact that Emma wasn't there. If she wasn't at Henderson Family Services, where was she? If my parents had lied about transferring her body, what else had they lied about? And if they had been dishonest about something as basic as where their supposed dead granddaughter was being kept, what did that mean about everything else they had told me? A man in his 60s emerged from a back office, wearing a dark suit, and the kind of somber expression funeral directors probably practiced in front of mirrors. He introduced himself as Thomas Henderson, the owner, and invited us into his private office for what he called a more confidential conversation. "I understand there's been some confusion about arrangements for your daughter," he said once we were seated. "I've reviewed our records carefully, and I can confirm that we have not received any infant remains from St. Mary's Medical Center in the past week." But my parents said, "Your parents have been clients of ours for many years," Henderson interrupted gently. "Robert serves on our board of directors, and the Luna family has a long history with our organization. But there are no current arrangements involving a child." Michael leaned forward in his chair. "So where is Emma's body?" "I'm afraid I can't answer that question," Henderson replied. "If arrangements were made, they were made elsewhere. Perhaps there was miscommunication about which funeral home would be handling services." But I knew there hadn't been miscommunication. My parents had been very specific about Henderson Family Services, very clear about the arrangements they had supposedly made. They had used their relationship with this place to lend credibility to their story, assuming I would never actually come here to verify their claims. "Mr. Henderson," I said carefully, "if my parents wanted to make arrangements for an infant, theoretical arrangements, what would that process look like?" "Theoretical arrangements?" He seemed puzzled by the question. "Hypothetically, if they came to you and said they needed to plan for the disposition of an infant's remains, what paperwork would be required? What documentation would you need?" Henderson glanced at Michael, then back at me. "We would need a death certificate issued by the county medical examiner, release forms from the hospital where death occurred, and authorization from the parents or legal guardians. Without those documents, we couldn't accept remains or provide services. And if someone wanted to bypass those requirements, if they wanted to make arrangements without proper documentation. That would be illegal, Henderson said firmly. We're a licensed funeral home. We follow all state and federal regulations regarding the handling of human remains. But theoretically, I pressed, if someone with influence wanted to bend those rules, if they had relationships that might allow them to circumvent normal procedures. Mrs. Chen, Henderson's voice carried a warning tone. I'm not sure what you're implying, but I can assure you that this establishment operates within the bounds of the law. I believed him. Whatever my parents had done, whatever lies they had told, Henderson Family Services wasn't involved in the cover-up. They were just another tool my parents had used to make their story seem credible, another institution whose reputation they had borrowed to support their deception. We left the funeral home with more questions than answers, but also with crucial information. Emma's body wasn't where my parents claimed it was, which meant either they had lied about her being dead, or they had lied about where her body was being kept. Either way, they had been dishonest about something fundamental, something that called into question everything else they had told us. What now? Michael asked as we sat in his truck in the funeral home parking lot. Now we go to the hospital, I said, and we demand to see the security footage from yesterday. Security footage? Every hospital has cameras, Michael. In the hallways, in the rooms, in the delivery areas. If Emma really died during delivery, if there really were complications, if my parents really made legitimate arrangements for her body, all of that will be on video. And if the hospital won't show us the footage, then we'll know they're part of the cover-up, too. The drive back to St. Mary's Medical Center felt different this time, charged with purpose rather than grief. I was no longer the devastated mother accepting whatever adults told me about my child's fate. I was a woman seeking answers, and I wasn't going to be deterred by professional sympathy or bureaucratic obstacles. The security office was located in the basement of the hospital, down a series of corridors that felt more like a corporate office building than a medical facility. The director, a woman named Sandra Phillips, was initially resistant to our request, citing patient privacy laws and hospital policies about releasing surveillance footage. I understand your loss, she said, her tone suggesting she had delivered similar speeches many times before. But security footage is only released to law enforcement agencies conducting official investigations or in response to court orders. We're not asking you to release anything, I said. We're asking to view footage of our own daughter's birth and death. We're asking to see video of events we should have been conscious to witness ourselves. The circumstances of your daughter's delivery are documented in medical records, Phillips replied. Those records are available to you through proper channels. Medical records can be falsified, Michael said bluntly. Video footage can't be. We want to see what actually happened. In that delivery room, Phillips looked uncomfortable with the directness of his statement. Are you suggesting that medical staff at this hospital filed false reports? We're suggesting that we want to verify what we've been told, I said carefully. We want to see evidence that supports the official version of events. And if we refuse your request? Then we'll assume you have something to hide, Michael replied, and we'll find other ways to get the information we need. The threat was vague, but effective. Phillips excused herself to make some phone calls, leaving us in her office surrounded by monitors showing real-time feeds from cameras throughout the hospital. As we waited, I studied the screens, watching nurses move through hallways, patients being wheeled from room to room, families gathering in waiting areas. Somewhere in this building's digital storage system was video of yesterday's events. Somewhere in miles of recorded footage was evidence of what had really happened during Emma's delivery. Proof of whether she had lived or died, documentation of every decision made about her care. Phillips returned after 20 minutes with a man I recognized as Hospital Administrator Karen Mitchell, who had been present during some of the confusing conversations the day before. Mitchell carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations and containing potential problems. "Mrs. Chen," Mitchell said, settling into a chair across from us, "I understand you have concerns about the events surrounding your daughter's delivery. I want to assure you that St. Mary's takes patient safety and satisfaction very seriously." "Then show us the security footage," I said without preamble. "Unfortunately, that's not something we can do without legal authorization. However, I can arrange for you to meet with Dr. Martinez and review the complete medical records from your daughter's birth." "I don't want to review records that might have been altered," I said. "I want to see unedited video of what happened in that delivery room." Mitchell exchanged a glance with Phillips. "Why do you believe the medical records might have been altered?" "Because nothing about yesterday makes sense," Michael said. "Because my wife was drugged unconscious during delivery and has no memory of our daughter being born. Because her parents were given information and decision-making authority that should have belonged to us. Because the story we're being told keeps changing depending on who's telling it." "Delivery can be traumatic," Mitchell said diplomatically. "Pain medication can affect memory formation. It's not unusual for mothers to have incomplete recollections of the birth process." "It's unusual for mothers to have no recollection," I countered. "It's unusual for parents to be excluded from decisions about their child's body. It's unusual for a baby's remains to disappear from the funeral home where they were supposedly taken." That last statement clearly caught Mitchell's attention. Her professional composure slipped for just a moment, revealing surprise or concern beneath the practiced sympathy. "The funeral home doesn't have your daughter's remains?" "Henderson Family Services has no record of receiving Emma's body," Michael confirmed. "They have no arrangements, no paperwork, no documentation of any kind. So either my in-laws lied about where they took her, or they lied about her being dead." "I see," Mitchell said slowly. "That is concerning. Let me look into this matter and see what information I can provide. In the meantime, would you be willing to meet with our patient advocate and Dr. Martinez to review the medical records?" "Only if we can also review the security footage," I said. "I want to see everything that happened yesterday, from the time we arrived until the time Emma was supposedly removed from the hospital." Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her options. Finally, she nodded. "I'll see what I can arrange," she said. "But I need to be clear that this is highly unusual. We don't typically allow families to review security footage, even of their own medical care." "These aren't typical circumstances," I replied, "and I'm not going to stop asking questions until I get answers that make sense." After Mitchell and Phillips left to make arrangements, Michael and I were alone in the security office with dozens of monitors showing live feeds from throughout the hospital. I found myself studying the screens obsessively, looking for patterns or anomalies that might provide clues about what had happened the day before. "Paulina," Michael said quietly, "what if we find out something we don't want to know?" "Like what?" "Like Emma really is dead. Like your parents were trying to protect you from seeing something traumatic. Like this whole investigation just confirms our worst fears." I considered his question carefully. "Then at least we'll know the truth. At least we'll have answers instead of lies and half-truths and stories that don't add up." "And if the truth is that your parents took Emma? If she's alive somewhere and they kidnapped her?" "Then we get her back," I said without hesitation, "and we make sure they never hurt anyone again." "And if the truth is something else entirely? Something we haven't thought of?" "Then we deal with whatever it is," I replied. "But we deal with it based on facts, not manipulation." Mitchell returned an hour later with news that the hospital's legal department had approved our request to review security footage, with the stipulation that a hospital representative would be present during the viewing, and that we would sign confidentiality agreements about what we observed. "The footage will be made available this afternoon," she said. "Dr. Martinez will Also be present to provide medical context for what you're seeing. What about my parents? I asked. Will they be notified that we're reviewing the footage? Not unless you request their presence, Mitchell replied. This is your decision as the patient and parent. I don't want them notified, I said, firmly. I don't want them to know we're investigating until we have all the facts. Mitchell nodded. That's your right. However, I should mention that your parents have been calling the hospital this morning, asking about your discharge and requesting updates on arrangements for your daughter. They seem very concerned about your well-being. Concerned about my well-being or concerned about what I might discover? I suspected the latter, but I kept that opinion to myself. What did you tell them? That you had been discharged, and that any further communication about your daughter's case would need to come through you directly, Mitchell said. We're not required to provide information to extended family members without your consent. Good, I said. I want all communication to go through Michael and me from now on. No exceptions. The afternoon appointment couldn't come soon enough. Michael and I spent the intervening hours at a coffee shop near the hospital, trying to eat food that tasted like cardboard and discussing scenarios that ranged from hopeful to horrifying. Every time my phone rang, I checked to see if it was my parents calling. When they finally did call, around 2 o'clock, I let it go to voicemail. The message my mother left was a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as concern. She spoke about how worried they were, how they wanted to support me through this difficult time, how they had been in touch with the funeral home to finalize arrangements for Emma's service. She mentioned that they had spoken with Dr. Martinez about my emotional state, and that everyone agreed I needed rest and support rather than stress and difficult decisions. Everyone agreed. Once again, my parents had positioned themselves as the responsible adults consulting with professionals about my welfare, making decisions based on expert opinions I hadn't been included in forming. They were managing my grief the same way they had managed every other aspect of my life, with the assumption that their judgment was superior to mine. The voicemail ended with my mother saying they would come to check on me that evening, bringing dinner and the paperwork I had requested. The message was phrased as an offer, but it felt like a threat. They were coming whether I wanted them to or not, bringing documents that might or might not be authentic, continuing their pattern of involvement in situations where they should have been supporting rather than controlling. When we returned to the hospital for our 3 o'clock appointment, I felt like I was about to witness the most important film of my life. Everything I thought I knew about the past 24 hours was about to be confirmed or destroyed by digital evidence that couldn't be argued with or explained away. Sandra Phillips led us to a conference room equipped with a large monitor and several chairs arranged around a table. Dr. Martinez was already there, along with Mitchell and a man introduced as the hospital's chief legal counsel. The formality of the setup suggested that everyone understood the seriousness of what we were about to review. Before we begin, the legal counsel said, I need to explain that what you're about to see may be disturbing. Delivery room footage can be graphic, and given the tragic outcome of your daughter's birth, you may find the viewing emotionally difficult. We understand, I said. We're prepared for whatever we see. I also need to emphasize that this footage is being shown to you as a courtesy and in the interest of providing closure. It's not intended for distribution or use outside this room. We understand that too, Michael said. We just want to know what happened to our daughter. Phillips began with footage from the hospital's exterior cameras, showing our arrival, the previous morning. I watched myself getting out of my father's car, visibly pregnant and clearly in labor, supported by my parents as we made our way to the entrance. Everything looked normal, routine, exactly as I remembered it. The hallway cameras showed our progress through the hospital to the labor and delivery ward. Again, nothing seemed unusual. My parents were attentive and supportive. I was focused on managing contractions, and the medical staff was professional and efficient. But when Philip switched to footage from inside the delivery room, everything changed. The camera angle showed the room from near the ceiling, providing a clear view of the bed, medical equipment, and everyone present during the delivery. I could see myself on the bed, connected to monitors and an IV line, with Dr. Martinez and two nurses moving around the room preparing for delivery. What I couldn't see, what the camera hadn't captured, was any sign of distress from Emma during the birth process. The monitors showed normal fetal heart rate. The medical staff appeared calm and routine in their preparations. Nothing in the Y. Footage suggested that complications were developing or that emergency interventions were necessary. Then I watched myself push, watched Dr. Martinez guide Emma into the world, watched my daughter emerge healthy and crying. She was alive. She was breathing. She was perfect. And then something strange happened. Dr. Martinez handed Emma to one of the nurses, who began routine newborn care procedures. But instead of bringing Emma to me, instead of placing her on my chest for immediate bonding, the nurse carried her to a warming station on the far side of the room. At the same time, I watched my father approach Dr. Martinez and speak to her quietly, too quietly for the camera's audio to pick up. Whatever he said caused the doctor to look concerned, then nod reluctantly. She moved to my bedside and began preparing a syringe. "What is she giving me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Pain medication," Dr. Martinez said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You were experiencing post-delivery discomfort." But on the screen, I could see that I was alert and asking questions, reaching toward the warming station where Emma was, being cleaned and examined. I could see myself trying to sit up, trying to see my daughter, clearly conscious and engaged despite whatever Dr. Martinez was preparing to inject. The syringe went into my IV line, and within seconds, I watched myself collapse into unconsciousness. Not sleep, not rest, but immediate, complete unconsciousness. Whatever drug they had given me, it wasn't standard post-delivery pain medication. And then, while I lay unconscious and helpless, I watched my father approach the nurse caring for Emma. I watched them have a conversation I couldn't hear. I watched the nurse look uncertain, then concerned, then frightened. I watched my father take Emma from the nurse's arms and walk out of the delivery room carrying my conscious, healthy, living daughter. The room around me went silent except for the sound of my own breathing, fast and shallow with shock and rage. On the screen, the nurse who had let my father take Emma was frantically trying to wake Dr. Martinez, who had stepped out of the room. Medical staff began rushing around, clearly agitated about something. But Emma was gone. My father had taken her, and no one seemed to know what to do about it. "Where did he go?" Michael's voice was deadly quiet. Phillips fast-forwarded through several camera angles, tracking my father's progress through the hospital corridors. The cameras showed him carrying Emma through hallways, into an elevator, down to the parking garage. The last clear shot showed him placing my daughter into the back seat of his car, securing her in what appeared to be a pre-installed infant car seat. He had planned this. He had come to the hospital prepared to take Emma, equipped with everything he needed to transport a newborn safely. This wasn't a spontaneous decision made in grief or confusion. This was premeditated kidnapping. "How long ago was this footage recorded?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Yesterday afternoon," Phillips replied. "Approximately 18 hours ago." 18 hours ago, my daughter had been alive and healthy, stolen from a hospital room while I lay unconscious from drugs I hadn't consented to receive. For 18 hours, my parents had lied to me about Emma's death while they kept her hidden somewhere for reasons I was only beginning to understand. "I want copies of this footage," Michael said. "I want every angle, every camera, every second of video that shows what happened to our daughter." "That will require legal authorization," the counsel replied. "Then get it," I said, standing up from my chair on unsteady legs. "Because we're going to the police, and we're going to press charges for kidnapping, and we're going to need evidence to support our case." Mrs. Chen, Dr. Martinez said quietly, I want you to know that I was told your daughter was in distress. Your father said you had requested that Emma be taken for immediate specialized care if complications arose. I never said that, I replied. I never authorized anyone to take my daughter anywhere. I never consented to being drugged unconscious. I never agreed to any of this. I realize that now, the doctor said, her voice heavy with what sounded like guilt. I should have verified those instructions with you directly. I should have questioned the unusual nature of the requests. Yes, I said simply. You should have. As we prepared to leave the hospital for the second time in 2 days, this time with digital evidence of my parents' crimes, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete clarity about who my parents really were and what they were capable of. They hadn't just stolen my daughter. They had orchestrated an elaborate deception involving medical professionals, funeral homes, and hospital administrators. They had drugged me unconscious to prevent me from stopping them. They had lied to my husband about Emma's condition to keep him away during the crucial hours after her birth. And they had done it all while positioning themselves as grieving grandparents, as supportive family members, as responsible adults making difficult decisions during a tragic time. But now I had proof. Now I had evidence that couldn't be explained, away or dismissed as grief-induced paranoia. Now I had the tools I needed to find Emma and bring her home. What I didn't know yet was that my parents had spent the past 18 hours implementing the next phase of their plan, a phase that would take Emma far beyond my reach if I didn't act quickly enough to stop them. The Phoenix Police Department's Family Crimes Unit occupied a cramped office in a downtown building that smelled like burnt coffee and desperation. Detective Maria Santos, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and graying hair, listened to our story with the kind of professional skepticism I had expected but hoped to avoid. She took notes in a small spiral notebook, occasionally asking for clarification about timelines or specific details, but her expression remained carefully neutral throughout our recounting of the events. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Detective Santos said after we finished explaining about the hospital footage and Emma's disappearance. You're alleging that your parents drugged you without consent during childbirth and then removed your healthy newborn from the hospital under false pretenses. That's exactly what I'm alleging, I said, and we have video evidence to prove it. Video evidence that the hospital has agreed to provide to law enforcement? Video evidence that they showed us this afternoon, Michael clarified. We watched my father-in-law carry our daughter out of the hospital while Paulina was unconscious from drugs she didn't agree to receive. Detective Santos made another note. And you believe your parents are currently in possession of the infant? I know they are, I said. The question is where they've taken her and what they plan to do with her. What do you think they plan to do with her? The question hung in the air like a challenge. It was one thing to accuse my parents of kidnapping Emma in a moment of poor judgment or family crisis. It was another thing entirely to speculate about their long-term intentions, especially when those speculations led to conclusions I barely wanted to think, much less voice to a police detective. I think they want to control me, I said finally. I think they've spent my entire life manipulating situations to maintain power over my decisions, and having a grandchild threatens that control. So you think they took your daughter to maintain psychological leverage over you? I think they took my daughter because she represents my independence from them, I replied. As long as Emma is missing, as long as I'm devastated and searching for her, I can't build a life with Michael that doesn't center my parents' involvement. Detective Santos looked skeptical. That seems like an extreme response to feeling displaced in their adult daughter's life. You don't know my parents, Michael said grimly. You don't know the lengths they've gone to control Paulina's choices over the years. Tell me about those lengths, Detective Santos said, pen poised over her notebook. So I did. I told her about the college applications submitted without my knowledge, the job interviews sabotaged through behind-the-scenes phone calls, the boyfriends driven away through character assassination and manipulation. I told her about the financial accounts they monitored, the living spaces they accessed without permission, the major life decisions they influenced through emotional manipulation and threats to withdraw support. I told her about the pattern of control that had defined my relationship with my parents for 30 years, a pattern that made Emma's disappearance feel like the inevitable escalation of behaviors that had been building toward this moment my entire life. "These are serious allegations," Detective Santos said when I finished. "If even half of what you're describing is accurate, it suggests a pattern of psychological abuse and financial manipulation." "It is accurate," I said. "And now they've graduated to kidnapping." "The hospital footage will be crucial evidence," the detective continued. "We'll need official copies of all relevant video, along with medical records documenting the unauthorized medication you received." "How long will that take?" Michael asked. "Depends on how cooperative the hospital is and whether they require court orders for disclosure. Could be days, could be weeks." "We don't have weeks," I said urgently. "Emma is 18 hours old. Every hour we delay is another hour my parents can use to move her farther away or implement whatever plan they've developed." "I understand your urgency," Detective Santos replied. "But we need to build a solid case before we can take action. Accusations of kidnapping against grandparents require substantial evidence, especially when those grandparents have community standing and financial resources." Community standing and financial resources. Of course. My parents weren't just any grandparents making poor decisions in a moment of crisis. They were Robert and Linda Luna, pillars of the Scottsdale community, board members and donors and respected citizens whose word would carry weight against mine. "What about the fact that Emma isn't where they said she would be?" Michael pressed. "What about their lies to the funeral home, their false stories about her death?" "Circumstantial evidence of deception," Detective Santos acknowledged. "Important, but not definitive proof of criminal intent. They could claim miscommunication, grief-induced confusion, attempts to protect you from trauma." "And the hospital footage showing my father carrying a healthy baby out of the building?" "More substantial evidence, but we'll need to establish that he didn't have permission to remove the child, if medical staff believed he had legitimate authority." "He didn't have authority," I interrupted. "Emma is my daughter, not his. I never gave permission for him to take her anywhere." "But were you conscious to give or deny permission at the time he removed her?" I stared at Detective Santos, understanding dawning with horrible clarity. "Are you saying that because they drugged me unconscious, they created a situation where they could claim authority they shouldn't have had?" "I'm saying that defense attorneys are very good at finding reasonable doubt," she replied. "If your parents have resources to hire experienced legal counsel, they'll argue that they acted in good faith based on medical advice or family emergency protocols." The conversation continued for another hour, with Detective Santos explaining the process for obtaining evidence, filing charges, and initiating search procedures. Everything she described sounded slow, bureaucratic, bound by procedures that seemed designed to protect the rights of accused criminals rather than help desperate parents find their stolen children. As we prepared to leave the police station, Detective Santos handed me her business card and a victim services pamphlet that felt like an insult. "I want to be clear that we're taking this seriously," she said. "But I also want you to understand that family court and criminal court operate on different timelines. Even if we find evidence to support kidnapping charges, getting your daughter back could take months of legal proceedings." Months. The word echoed in my head as Michael and I walked to his truck. Emma would be walking and talking by the time the legal system finished protecting my parents' rights and considering their defense strategies. She would have forgotten the sound of my voice, the feeling of my heartbeat, the bond we should have been building from her first moments of life. "We can't wait for the police," I said as Michael started the engine. We need to find Emma ourselves. How? We start with what we know. My parents took her somewhere. They've had 18 hours to move her, but they can't have gone too far with a newborn. She needs formula, diapers, medical care if anything goes wrong. You think they're still in Phoenix? I think they're somewhere close enough to monitor our reactions and maintain control of the situation, I said. This isn't about disappearing forever. This is about keeping Emma close enough to use her as leverage. Michael nodded grimly. Where do we start looking? We start with their house, I said. We find out if they're there, if Emma is there, if there's any evidence of where they might have taken her. And if they see us coming, then we have a conversation they're not going to like. The drive to my parents' house in Scottsdale took us through neighborhoods that represented everything I had grown up believing I was supposed to want. Manicured lawns, Spanish tile roofs, 3-car garages housing vehicles that cost more than most people's annual salaries. It was the kind of suburban prosperity my parents had worked their entire lives to achieve and maintain. The kind of lifestyle they expected me to appreciate and aspire to duplicate. But as we turned onto their street, all I could think about was how that prosperity had been built on control, manipulation, and the systematic destruction of my autonomy. The beautiful house with its perfectly maintained exterior had been the headquarters for 30 years of psychological manipulation, the place where decisions about my life had been made without my input or consent. Now it might be the place where my stolen daughter was being held. My parents' car was in the driveway, along with a second vehicle I didn't recognize. A silver sedan with temporary license plates, the kind of car someone might rent or purchase quickly if they needed transportation that couldn't be easily traced back to them. There's someone else here, Michael observed. Or they bought a new car, I said. Maybe something more suitable for transporting a baby. We parked across the street and sat in Michael's truck, watching the house for signs of activity. The windows were covered with blinds that made it impossible to see inside, and the front yard was empty of any evidence that a baby was in residence. No stroller on the porch, no car seat visible through the garage windows, no indication that my parents had suddenly become grandparents caring for an infant. But Emma was 18 hours old. She wouldn't need a stroller or outdoor equipment yet. She would need formula, bottles, diapers, clothes, and a safe place to sleep. All things that could be purchased quickly and kept inside a house where neighbors wouldn't notice them. I'm going to the front door, I said, reaching for the truck's door handle. Paulina, wait, Michael said, catching my arm. We should think about this. If Emma is in there, if your parents are hiding her, confronting them directly might make them run. And if we wait for the police to build their case, they might run anyway, I replied. At least if I knock on the door, I can see their reactions. I can look for signs that Emma is there. What if they don't let you in? Then I'll know they're hiding something. Michael studied my face for a moment, then nodded. I'm coming with you. No, stay here and watch the house. If they try to leave with Emma, follow them and call Detective Santos. I don't like the idea of you going in there alone. I've been alone with my parents my entire life, I said. The difference is that now I know what they're capable of. The walk to my parents' front door felt like the longest 30 seconds of my life. Every step took me closer to a confrontation I had been avoiding for 3 decades, a moment of truth that would either reunite me with my daughter or confirm my worst fears about the people who had raised me. I rang the doorbell and waited, listening for any sound from inside the house that might indicate Emma's presence. A baby's cry, adult voices discussing infant care, the kinds of noises that would accompany caring for a newborn. But the house was silent except for the sound of footsteps approaching the door. My mother opened the door, wearing a casual dress and an expression of surprise that seemed too rehearsed to be genuine. Behind her, I could see my father in the living room, sitting in his recliner with a newspaper that he quickly folded and set aside. Paulina, sweetheart, my mother said, her voice warm with what sounded like genuine pleasure. What a nice surprise. We were just talking about coming to check on you this evening. I wanted to talk to you both, I said, studying her face for any sign of guilt or nervousness. About Emma. Of course, my mother said, stepping aside to let me enter. Come in, sit down. You look tired. Are you eating enough? The hospital? Said you were discharged this morning, but we thought you might want to stay another day for observation. The hospital said. Of course, they had been in contact with the hospital, monitoring my discharge, tracking my movements, probably calling every few hours to check on my emotional state and whether I was asking uncomfortable questions. Where is Emma? I asked without accepting her invitation to sit down. My parents exchanged a glance that lasted a fraction of a second too long. Sweetheart, my father said gently, Emma is at Henderson Family Services. We explained this yesterday. The arrangements have been made. No, she isn't, I said, watching their faces carefully. I went to Henderson Family Services this morning. They have no record of Emma's body, no arrangements, no paperwork. Thomas Henderson himself confirmed that you haven't brought them any infant remains. The silence that followed my statement was deafening. My mother's face went pale, and my father's jaw tightened in a way I recognized from childhood, the expression he wore when he was calculating how much truth he could reveal without losing control of a situation. There must have been some confusion, my mother said finally. Perhaps the paperwork hasn't been processed yet, or, there's no confusion, I interrupted. There's no paperwork because Emma isn't dead. There are no arrangements because her body was never transferred to any funeral home. Paulina, my father said, his voice carrying the warning tone I had learned to fear as a child. You're clearly still traumatized by yesterday's events. Grief can cause confusion, can make people imagine things that aren't real. I'm not imagining anything, I said firmly. I've seen the hospital security footage. I watched you carry my living, breathing daughter out of that delivery room while I was unconscious from drugs I never consented to receive. The mask of concern and sympathy slipped from both their faces simultaneously, replaced by expressions I had never seen before, but somehow recognized. Cold calculation, the look of people who had been caught in a lie and were deciding how much additional truth they could afford to reveal. The security footage, my mother repeated slowly. Every second of it, I confirmed. From the moment we arrived at the hospital until the moment you walked out carrying Emma. The police have copies, Detective Santos is building a case, and this house is about to be searched for evidence of kidnapping. Kidnapping? My father's voice was sharp with what might have been genuine shock. Paulina, you can't be serious. Where is my daughter? I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. Where is Emma? Emma is dead, my mother said, but her voice lacked conviction. We know this is difficult for you to accept, but stop lying to me. The words came out as a shout that probably carried to Michael waiting in the truck across the street. I saw the footage. I watched you take her. She was alive and healthy and you stole her from the hospital. My father stood up from his recliner, moving toward me with the kind of purposeful stride that had intimidated me throughout childhood. But I wasn't a child anymore, and fear of his disapproval no longer had the power to silence me. Paulina, you need to calm down, he said. You're being hysterical, and this kind of behavior isn't helping anyone. This kind of behavior? I stared at him in disbelief. You mean the behavior of a mother looking for her stolen child? You mean the behavior of someone who refuses to accept lies about her daughter's death? We are trying to protect you, my mother said, her voice taking on the patient tone she had always used when she thought I was being unreasonable. Sometimes protection requires difficult decisions that the protected person doesn't understand or appreciate at the time. Protect me from what? From making mistakes that would ruin your life, my father said, from choices that would destroy your future and your family's reputation. What mistakes? What choices? Emma is my daughter. Emma is the daughter of a man we barely know, my mother said, her voice growing harder. A man without education, without prospects, without the kind of background that would make him a suitable father for our grandchild. The truth was, finally emerging, the real reason behind their elaborate deception. This wasn't about protecting me or helping me through grief. This was about their disapproval of Michael, their judgment that he wasn't good enough for their family, their determination to prevent Emma from being raised by someone they considered beneath their standards. You took my daughter because you don't approve of my husband? We took your daughter, my father said, abandoning all pretense, because she deserves better than being raised in poverty by parents who can't provide for her properly. Michael and I can provide for her just fine. Can you? My mother asked. Can you afford private schools, college tuition, the kind of opportunities that ensure success in life? Can you give her the advantages she deserves? Or will she grow up struggling the way you would struggle if you stayed married to him? That's not your decision to make. It became our decision, my father said coldly, when you proved that you couldn't make responsible choices for yourself. The conversation was spiraling toward territory I had never imagined possible, revelations about my parents' true nature that made me feel like I was meeting strangers who happened to wear familiar faces. These people had raised me, claimed to love me, positioned themselves as my protectors and guides. But everything they were saying now revealed a level of manipulation and control that went far beyond overprotective parenting. Where is Emma? I asked again, my voice deadly quiet. Emma is somewhere safe, my mother said. Somewhere she'll be cared for by people who can give her the life she deserves. You gave her away. The words came out as barely more than a whisper. You gave my daughter to strangers. We gave her to a family that was properly vetted, financially stable, and capable of providing the kind of upbringing that will ensure her success, my father said. The kind of family you should have chosen for yourself if you had been thinking clearly. The room started spinning around me. Not only had my parents stolen Emma from the hospital, not only had they lied about her death and created an elaborate cover story, but they had already transferred her to someone else. They had given my 18-hour-old daughter to people I had never met, people who would raise her according to standards my parents had set without my input or consent. What family? I managed to ask. Who did you give her to? People who will love her and care for her properly, my mother said. People who understand the importance of providing children with stability and opportunity. I want names. I want addresses. I want to know exactly who has my daughter. That information is confidential, my father said, for everyone's protection, including Emma's. Including Emma's protection from her own mother? Including Emma's protection from a mother who isn't ready to be a responsible parent, my mother said. Someday, when you've grown up and learned to make better choices, you might understand that we did this out of love. Out of love. The phrase that had justified every boundary they had crossed, every decision they had made without consulting me, every moment of control they had exerted over my life. They had stolen my daughter out of love, drugged me unconscious out of love, lied to me about her death out of love. I'm calling the police, I said, reaching for my phone. The police won't be able to help you, my father said calmly. The adoption was handled through proper legal channels. Emma is now the daughter of parents who are prepared to care for her appropriately. Adoption? The word hit me like a physical blow. You can't arrange an adoption without my consent. I'm her mother. You're a mother who was declared temporarily unfit due to emotional instability following a traumatic delivery, my mother said. The psychiatric evaluation recommended immediate intervention to protect the child's welfare. What psychiatric evaluation? I never saw a psychiatrist. Dr. Richardson met with you while you were sedated, my father explained, He determined that your mental state posed a potential risk to infant safety. Dr. Richardson, another name I didn't recognize, another professional who had apparently made decisions about my competency without my knowledge or participation. How many people had my parents involved in this conspiracy? How many doctors, lawyers, and officials had they convinced to participate in stealing my child? "You're lying," I said, though part of me was beginning to understand that they might not be lying about everything. They might have actually found legal ways to accomplish their illegal goals, professionals willing to participate in their plan as long as the paperwork looked legitimate. "We're protecting you and Emma from the consequences of your poor judgment," my mother said. "Someday you'll thank us." "I will never thank you for this," I said, backing toward the front door. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you pay for what you've done." "Paulina," my father said, his voice taking on the threatening tone I remembered from childhood arguments, "I suggest you think very carefully about your next steps. There are legal consequences for making false accusations, for harassing adoptive families for interfering with properly executed child welfare decisions." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm advising you to consider the reality of your situation," he replied. "Emma is gone. The adoption is final. The best thing you can do now is accept that and focus on rebuilding your life in a more responsible direction." I stared at them both. These people who had raised me but had never actually known me, who had claimed to love me while systematically destroying my autonomy, who had stolen my daughter while positioning themselves as the responsible adults, making difficult decisions for everyone's benefit. "This isn't over," I said, opening the front door. "Yes, it is," my mother said sadly. "It's been over since the moment you chose to marry someone unsuitable and create a child you weren't prepared to raise properly." I walked out of that house knowing that everything had changed forever, that there was no possibility of repair or reconciliation with the people who had given me life, but had never allowed me to live it. They had revealed themselves completely, shown me exactly who they were and what they were capable of when their control was threatened. But they had also made a crucial mistake. They had told me too much, revealed too many details about their plan, given me information I could use to track down the people who now had Emma. An adoption arranged through legal channels meant paperwork, court filings, official records that could be searched and examined. A psychiatrist named Dr. Richardson meant someone whose credentials and involvement could be investigated. A family that had been properly vetted meant an adoption agency or legal service that had facilitated the transfer. My parents thought they had covered all the bases, created an unassailable legal framework for their theft of Emma. But legal frameworks created paper trails, and paper trails could be followed by people who refused to give up. As I walked back to Michael's truck, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Emma's birth. Hope. Not the hope that this would be easy or quick, but the hope that it was possible. The hope that my daughter could be found and brought home. What I didn't know yet was that my parents had made more than one crucial mistake. What I didn't know was that their elaborate plan had weaknesses they hadn't anticipated, vulnerabilities that would ultimately destroy everything they had worked to achieve. What I didn't know was that the truth was about to become their enemy, in ways they had never imagined possible. 3 weeks after confronting my parents, I sat in a courtroom watching my father being led away in handcuffs. The silver hair that had always been perfectly styled was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled from a night in holding, and his face carried the bewildered expression of someone who had never imagined facing consequences for his actions. My mother wept quietly in the gallery behind me, her tears flowing not for Emma or for the pain she had caused, but for the destruction of the carefully constructed life she had spent decades building. The woman who had always appeared so composed, so in control of every situation, looked fragile and broken as she watched her husband being processed as a criminal. Detective Santos had been right about one thing. Building a solid case took time. But she had been wrong about how long justice would take. The hospital security footage, combined with financial records showing payments to Dr. Richardson and documentation of the falsified psychiatric evaluation, had created an undeniable pattern of fraud and kidnapping that even expensive defense attorneys couldn't explain away. Dr. Richardson had been the weak link in their plan. When federal investigators began examining his credentials, they discovered that his license had been suspended in 2 other states for ethical violations involving falsified patient evaluations. His willingness to declare me mentally unfit, based on a bedside observation while I was sedated, had been purchased for $50,000, a transaction my father had foolishly completed through a traceable bank transfer. The adoption agency that had facilitated Emma's placement, Sunshine Family Services, had been operating without proper state licensing and had a history of expedited placements that circumvented normal waiting periods and background checks. Their cooperation with my parents' timeline had been motivated by a substantial donation to their building fund, another financial trail that investigators followed to its inevitable conclusion. But the breakthrough that led to Emma's recovery had come from an unexpected source: the adoptive family themselves. Richard and Margaret Hoffman were in their 50s, financially comfortable but unable to have biological children, who had been waiting for years to adopt an infant through legitimate channels. When Sunshine Family Services contacted them about an available newborn, they had been told that the birth parents were young and unprepared for parenthood, seeking a closed adoption to give their daughter the best possible life. They had no reason to question the story, no way to know that Emma had been stolen rather than willingly surrendered. But when news reports about the kidnapping began circulating, Margaret Hoffman recognized Emma's photograph and realized they had become unwitting participants in a crime. The phone call from Mrs. Hoffman to Detective Santos had been the moment everything changed. "I think we have the baby you're looking for," she had said, her voice shaking with emotion. "We thought we were adopting a child whose parents wanted her to have a better life. We never imagined she had been taken from a mother who was desperately searching for her." The reunion had taken place in Detective Santos's office, with social workers and attorneys present to ensure everything was handled properly. When Mrs. Hoffman placed Emma in my arms for the first time since her birth, I felt like I could breathe again after 3 weeks of suffocation. Emma had been cared for beautifully. She was healthy, alert, and had clearly been loved by people who believed they were doing what was best for a child in need. The Hoffmans had kept detailed records of her feeding schedule, sleep patterns, and developmental milestones, documentation they turned over to me with tears in their eyes. "We're so sorry," Mr. Hoffman had said as he handed me a folder containing Emma's care records. "We thought we were helping a child who needed a family. We never would have participated if we had known the truth." I believed him. The Hoffmans were victims too, people whose desire to become parents had been exploited by my parents and the corrupt adoption agency they had enlisted. Their grief at losing Emma was real, even though their legal claim to her had been based on fraud. The criminal trial had been swift once all the evidence was assembled. My father was convicted of kidnapping, conspiracy, fraud, and bribery. My mother was found guilty of conspiracy and accessory charges. Dr. Richardson faced federal charges for falsifying medical records and participating in child trafficking. The adoption agency was shut down, and its director was awaiting trial on multiple felony counts. But the legal consequences, satisfying as they were, couldn't undo the damage my parents had inflicted or repair the relationships they had destroyed. The 3 weeks Emma had spent with the Hoffmans were 3 weeks of bonding and attachment that we would never get back. 3 weeks when she should have been learning the sound of my voice and the feeling of my heartbeat. Michael and I had spent those weeks in a kind of suspended animation, filing legal motions and working with investigators while our daughter grew and developed in the care of strangers. We had missed her first smile, her first responses to familiar voices, the tiny daily changes that mark a newborn's early development. The Hoffmans, to their credit, had documented everything with photographs and videos, creating a record of Emma's first weeks that they shared with us despite their own heartbreak. Watching video of my 3-week-old daughter being fed and cuddled by people I had never met was both precious and painful, evidence of time stolen by my parents' selfish actions. The civil lawsuits were ongoing. We were seeking damages from my parents, Dr. Richardson, and Sunshine Family Services for the emotional trauma, lost bonding time, and financial costs associated with finding Emma. Our attorney was confident that the financial settlements would be substantial, enough to ensure Emma's future education and provide some measure of justice for what we had endured. But money couldn't restore trust or rebuild family relationships. My parents' extended family, aunts and uncles and cousins who had known them as respectable community members, struggled to reconcile the people they thought they knew with the criminals who had stolen their own grandchild. Some family members cut contact entirely, unable to process the scope of my parents' deception. Others maintained relationships while keeping careful distance from Michael, Emma, and me. The ripple effects extended beyond family. My parents' friends and social circle, the community organizations where they had served on boards and committees, the church where they had been active members for decades, all had to grapple with the reality that people they had trusted and respected were capable of such calculated cruelty. For me, the aftermath was about learning to be a mother under circumstances I had never anticipated. Emma came home to us as a 4-week-old infant who had been cared for by loving strangers, fed formula instead of breast milk, soothed by voices she didn't recognize. Re-establishing our bond required patience and time, help from lactation consultants, and pediatric psychologists who specialized in adoption and attachment disruption. There were nights when Emma cried inconsolably, and I wondered if she was mourning the loss of the Hoffmans, the only parents she had known for most of her short life. There were days when I felt like I was caring for someone else's child, when the natural maternal instincts I had expected seemed muted by the trauma of our separation. But gradually, slowly, we found our rhythm. Emma began to recognize my scent, to calm at the sound of my voice, to settle against my chest in the way newborns do with their mothers. The pediatrician assured us that the disruption wouldn't have lasting effects, that babies are resilient and adaptable, that love and consistency would heal whatever damage had been done. Michael proved to be an extraordinary father, patient and gentle and completely devoted to Emma's well-being. He took leave from his construction job to help with the adjustment period, spending hours holding Emma and talking to her, helping her learn to trust us as her parents. His anger toward my parents was profound but controlled, channeled into determination to be the kind of father who would protect Emma from ever experiencing such betrayal again. The media attention was intense but brief. The story of grandparents kidnapping their own grandchild captured public interest for a few weeks, generating outrage and disbelief in equal measure. We gave one interview to a local television station, partly to set the record straight, and partly to warn other families about the dangers of manipulative relatives and corrupt adoption agencies. The interview had been difficult, but cathartic. Sitting together on our couch with Emma sleeping in my arms, Michael and I told our story to a reporter who seemed genuinely moved by what we had endured. The segment aired during prime time and generated hundreds of supportive messages from viewers who had experienced similar family manipulation, though none quite as extreme as what we had faced. Dr. Martinez, the obstetrician who had delivered Emma and been manipulated into participating in my parents' plan, reached out to apologize and offer her support. She had been traumatized by her unwitting role in the kidnapping and had implemented new protocols at the hospital to prevent similar situations. Her guilt was genuine, and her commitment to ensuring that other mothers wouldn't face what I had faced was reassuring. The hospital itself conducted a comprehensive review of their security and patient advocacy procedures. The ease with which my father had been able to remove Emma from the delivery ward exposed serious weaknesses in their systems, weaknesses that could have been exploited by any determined individual with harmful intentions. As Emma grew from a newborn to an infant to a toddler, the acute crisis of her kidnapping faded into something more manageable, but no less significant. We celebrated her first birthday with a joy tempered by awareness of how close we had come to losing her permanently. Her first words, first steps, first attempts at independence were precious partly because we understood how easily those milestones could have belonged to someone else. My relationship with my extended family remained complicated. Some relatives had been genuinely shocked by my parents' actions and offered unwavering support. Others seemed to believe that there must have been some justification for what my parents had done, some element of the story that explained or excused their behavior. A few maintained that family disputes should be handled privately, that involving law enforcement had been an overreaction. Those relationships didn't survive. I had learned the difference between people who loved me unconditionally and people who loved me only when I behaved according to their expectations. The crisis had forced everyone to choose sides, and the choices people made revealed truths about their character that couldn't be overlooked or forgiven. Michael and I began seeing a family therapist who specialized in trauma recovery and trust rebuilding. The sessions helped us process the betrayal and violation we had experienced, teaching us tools for managing the anxiety and hypervigilance that followed such a profound breach of safety. Learning to trust institutions, medical professionals, and even family members again required deliberate effort and professional guidance. Emma, thankfully, showed no signs of lasting trauma from her early weeks with the Hoffmans. She was a happy, healthy child who bonded strongly with Michael and me, who reached all her developmental milestones on schedule, who seemed to carry no unconscious memory of the disruption that had marked her first month of life. The Hoffmans sent birthday cards and holiday greetings for the first few years, maintaining contact that was both painful and meaningful. They had truly loved Emma during their brief time as her parents, and their grief at losing her was real and deserving of acknowledgement. Eventually, the cards stopped coming as they found peace and moved forward with their lives. My parents served their sentences in different facilities, their once unified front fractured by the stress of criminal prosecution and incarceration. My mother wrote letters from prison, attempting to justify their actions and expressing hope for eventual reconciliation. I never responded. There were no words that could bridge the gap between us, no explanation that could excuse what they had done. My father maintained his silence, apparently believing that dignified acceptance of his punishment would somehow restore his reputation or demonstrate his inherent nobility. His letters, when they came, were formal and distant, acknowledging his mistakes without accepting responsibility for the deliberate cruelty of his choices. Both letters went unanswered. I had no interest in helping my parents process their guilt or work toward forgiveness they hadn't earned. Their consequences were theirs to bear, just as the trauma they had inflicted was mine to heal from. Years later, as Emma grew into a confident, intelligent child who knew nothing of her dramatic early weeks, I reflected on how the experience had changed me. The young woman who had deferred to her parents' judgment about every major life decision had been replaced by someone who trusted her own instincts and refused to accept other people's definitions of what was best for her family. The crisis had stripped away illusions I had carried about family loyalty, parental love, and the fundamental goodness of people who claimed to care about me. But it had also revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed, the fierce protectiveness of motherhood, and the power of refusing to accept unacceptable situations. Emma deserved to grow up knowing that her parents would fight for her, that no one had the right to make decisions about her life without her consent, that love meant respecting autonomy rather than controlling choices. The lessons my parents had tried to teach through manipulation and force, I would teach through example and respect. The security footage that had documented my parents' crimes remained stored in police evidence files, a digital record of the moment when their facade of caring grandparents was revealed as a mask for calculated selfishness. That footage had been our salvation, proof that couldn't be denied or explained away, evidence that transformed accusations into convictions. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if those cameras hadn't existed, if my parents' plan had succeeded completely. Would Emma have grown up believing the Hoffmans were her biological parents? Would I have spent the rest of my life mourning a daughter I believed was dead? Would my parents have maintained their deception indefinitely, secure in the knowledge that their crimes couldn't be proven? The questions were unanswerable and ultimately irrelevant. The cameras had existed, the truth had been documented, and justice had been served. Emma was home where she belonged, and my parents were facing consequences appropriate to their actions. As I tucked Emma into bed on the night of her 3rd birthday, listening to her chatter about the cake and presents and friends who had celebrated, with her, I felt the deep satisfaction of a life reclaimed. She was safe, loved, and growing up in a home where her worth wasn't conditional on meeting other people's expectations. The woman who had once accepted her parents' judgment about every aspect of her life had become someone who made her own decisions and stood by them. The daughter who had been told she was too paranoid, too emotional, too unreasonable to trust her own perceptions had learned to listen to her instincts and act on them. My parents had stolen 3 weeks of Emma's infancy, but they had inadvertently given me something more valuable: the knowledge that I was strong enough to fight for what mattered, smart enough to seek the truth when faced with lies, and brave enough to reject the people who had shaped me when they proved themselves unworthy of my trust. The security cameras had captured their crimes, but they had also documented the birth of my independence. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.